Hello there, welcome back to the booth here at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. I'm Marshall Sutcliffe, joined by Reed Duke. Reed, it's great to have you along for semifinal coverage here. We've got him the rest of the way. Thanks so much for taking the time, Reed. By the way, we really do appreciate your presence here in the booth. We've got our first semifinal match set for you. It could be quick. You're not going to want to go anywhere. In the feature match area, we have Tae Junhao playing red-white aggro. Also on red-white aggro on the other side of the table, Andrew Elenbogen. They're ready. Let's head on down. It's time for the first semifinal here from Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. Hello and welcome back to coverage here at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. I'm Marshall Sutcliffe. I'm in the booth with Reed Duke, and we are all set for semifinal number one, where in the feature match area, we have from Singapore, Tae Junhao playing red-white aggro for Team Grey Ogre Games. Finished with a 12-3-1 record. His opponent, Andrew Elenbogen from the United States, also on red-white aggro, scraped in at 12-4. Andrew was the only one at that record to make it into the top 8. He's playing for Team Cardboard live. And we are underway here, Reed. Fast matchup. What do you expect?
Well, we have more or less a mirror match on our hands here. A couple of individual card choice differences. Tae Junhao having heroic reinforcements in his main deck, whereas Andrew Elenbogen is mono white in terms of his spells. But I think it's really going to be about who is on the play, in this case Tae Junhao, who has good draws, who hits their land drops on time, and who gets to make those big attacks. The key cards to watch out for beyond the heroic reinforcements that I just mentioned, things like Banalish Marshall.
Marshall's great. Nobody's disagreeing in here.
Getting your creatures to outsize the opponents and make profitable attacks is really going to be the key to this matchup. And the great thing about Banalish Marshall is even if it gets answered, sometimes the damage is done already. Getting to send your whole team and force the opponent to either take massive damage or trade unfavorably. Sometimes it's too late, even if it's met with Conclave Tribunal the following turn.
Keep telling me the great things about Marshall. I got a lot of time today for that. By the way, Rustwing Falcon hitting the battlefield here. Trusty Rusty is on the battlefield and holding back the vastly inferior Healer's Hawk here.
Yeah,
that was all the way back on turn number one. This board developing very quickly, Reed. As you can see, none of the haymakers that you just mentioned, but the one-drops are in effect here with both players on Legion's Landing, the birds staring at each other, and then a couple of bodyguards as well.
Yep, both players with the one-drop into one-drop start. That's so terrifying out of these white weenie decks. And here with Tae Junhao having the option to transform his Legion's Landing, but instead he's just going to add the most power and toughness to the battlefield that he possibly can by deploying Venerated Loxodon.
That's right. So he's going to play 4/4 and get 3+1/+1 counters on various creatures here.
Your play is very wise.
Trying to set up, and he says, you know what? I like that plan. Andrew Elenbogen slams his own copy of Venerated Loxodon, though this could be very costly to him, as the shields are relatively down, his only blocker, the 4/4 itself.
I love to see this at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. The Convoke mechanic, new again with this set, allowing these players to tap 2 lands and add 7 power and toughness to the battlefield, each on their turn 3s. Venerated Loxodon is a super cool card, very, very powerful in a deck like this that plays a low land count but a high density of cheap creatures.
Well, you can see where a card like Banalish Marshall just puts you so far over the top in a matchup like this. It looks like Conclave Tribunal here for Tae is going to take the only remaining blocker from Andrew Elenbogen and clear the way for what looks to be quite an attack.
Yeah, so this is going to be First Blood, a big attack, transforming the Legion's Landing. So you see Tae Junhao with now a large life total advantage, mana advantage, and just power and toughness advantage since his Loxodon is alive to continue attacking, whereas Andrew Elenbogen's is off the battlefield.
Bang, look at that. Down to 9 is Andrew Elenbogen as he untaps here. And boy, he has his hands full. And unfortunately for him, his hands are full of spells and no more lands. Look at the raw power in Andrew Elenbogen's hand, and it just feels like he's not going to have a chance to deploy it.
Yeah, Adanto Vanguard, a really poorly set up creature for a defensive position like this, where you're on the draw, you're playing from behind. The saving grace is he does have Conclave's Tribunal, which we talked about. When you're stuck on lands, you can still cast some of your Convoke spells. But the question is what to hit. You could take out your opponent's Loxodon, you could take out your opponent's Conclave Tribunal. However, unlike some creatures with powerful enters the battlefield abilities, the Loxodon's not going to re-trigger, because if it comes back into play via Conclave Tribunal, it will not put counters on anything.
Looks like we have race initiated. One of the really cool things about Legion's Landing is that it can become Adanto the First Fort and unlock even more spells out of Elenbogen's hand. Look at this. He's going to take the big attack, cracking back into Taejun Hao's life total, bringing him to 15, and then using that transformed land to play History of Benalia.
So Andrew deciding that he needs to take a gamble here in order to develop his mana. We did mention he's missed 2 land drops and really needed the Legion's Landing to transform. But as you mentioned, he is in essentially on chump block duty here. It looks like it's just short of lethal due to the 2 points of life he gained from his vampire token. But yeah, he's got to batten down the hatches here and expect to start his next turn at a low life total if he gets a next turn at all.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Andrew Elenbogen, his ability to race looks limited, but he does have Healer's Hawk and Vampire Token, both with a +1/+1 counter on them. And that, it does pad his life total significantly and makes the combat math a bit more difficult for Taejun Hao.
History of Benalia, of course, one of the hallmark cards of this white deck. And the good news for Andrew is he invested his mana up front onto the History of Benalia. He got a chump blocker, and now next turn he's going to sort of get a double effect by resolving Chapter 2 of his saga at no mana cost and deploying a spell from his hand. So if he does survive this turn, he'll likely buy himself a little bit of breathing room on turn 5, next turn. But we'll see if it's going to be enough.
So I go to 6.
Elenbogen back down to 6 life now.
These players have surely trained themselves to be very precise with the combat math, the life totals between all of these bolstering creature abilities, lifelink, close combat races. This deck is not an easy one to play. There's a lot to keep track of, a lot to think about.
If Elenbogen plays the Banalish Marshal here, is he just winning the race at this point? He gets to attack with 2 3/3 lifelinkers?
Yeah, now, one thing to keep in mind is the Adanto First Fort on Taejun Hao's side, which is helpful in a mana flood situation, which seems to be a little bit of the case. With the 2/3 Rustwing Falcon and the fresh 1/1 lifelink off Adanto, he can make at least a reasonably profitable block. But you did mention that, this is a case of the player drawing out of their early mana screw and still having a stacked hand might be able to make a comeback. I like this conservative attack from Andrew, focusing on his own life total rather than Taejun Hao's. He knows that if he can survive and deploy his hand, he'll have such a massive advantage that there's no need to rush things.
And Taejun Hao, well, he's out of gasoline here. Take a look at his hand. Womp, just a plains.
I go to 12, you go to 11? Yep. Okay, go ahead.
And now Andrew Elenbogen is ahead in the life total race by 1. As we know, that can swing quite wildly. But still, he has clawed himself back to at least even here. Looks like Adanto Vanguard was the draw step there for Taejun Hao, but that's not going to do anything to the board immediately. Adanto the First Fort playing a big role for both players as it's giving Taejun Hao something to do with his extra mana, and it acted as Andrew Elenbogen's 3rd land drop this game.
Boy, must be a frustrating game from Taejun Hao's perspective. He was so close to getting to the finish line, but he was not able to get Andrew Elenbogen to 0, and the result is that now his board position has quickly slipped away. His opponent's creatures are larger. The lifelink has caused him to lose his life total advantage, and now he has nothing in his hand. And with History of Benalia triggering Chapter 3 next turn, he's the one who's going to have to hunker down and make some blocks.
Yeah, this one looks like it may be slipping away. This is a pattern that you see in Magic actually quite frequently, where the player who doesn't have quite enough lands, if they're able to just make it to the point where they find those lands, they have a handful of spells and they can take over the game over the player with too many lands.
Precisely. That's going to come up a lot in these sort of mirror matches where you really want to work hard to punish a stumble from the opponent, because if you give them enough time to draw out of it, they'll stabilize the board and still have this great hand. So you need to generate a large, hopefully irreversible advantage while your opponent is stumbling on mana if you're going to win the game. And it looks like in this case,
Outblock.
Junhao was just not quite able to do it.
Andrew says, sure, I'll trade off. What's your follow-up? We know what it is. It's a Danto Vanguard. It hits the battlefield, and Andrew Elenbogen gets yet another untap with this stacked hand of his. I mean, let's just take a quick check-in on his hand. Double a Danto Vanguard, another Benalish Marshal, and even a Conclave Tribunal if there's a particularly problematic permanent on the other side of the battlefield.
Yeah, the world is his oyster here. He can just add more power and toughness via Benalish Marshal. Don't forget that the History of Benalia went off this turn, so he's got a giant Vigilant Knight in addition to Benalish Marshal itself getting pumped +2/+1 for the turn. So we'll see what he decides to send into the fray. We're going to be seeing a lot of this for the remainder of Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. Players analyzing combat, trying to predict how the opponent might block, sending the most favorable possible team into the red zone. And here he decides it's everything.
By the way, this happens a lot. I think it's more like I'm making sure that when I just want to attack with everything that it's not a disaster for me in some way, because I have never seen people tank for so long and they'd be like, attack with all of them. Well, you can see why, though. These decks just aren't particularly well set up to be on defense. The turn when your History of Benalia goes off, that's on your turn. That's when you can attack. Cards like a Danto Vanguard that you mentioned a minute ago, Reed, just much better suited for attacking than blocking.
6/5s, yeah. And he's both 4/4s.
If you're watching at home, planning on maybe taking one of these decks for a spin at a local tournament, you can really learn from the way these players navigate the games. I think there's a natural tendency when you play a fast, aggressive deck to play fast and aggressive physically, make your decisions fast, attack fast, everything. But that's just not the way to play. These decks really do require careful navigation of the combat steps, and even when things look really favorable, that's exactly the moment when you want to make sure you're not blundering into a trap, and you want to make sure that you are being as careful as possible and not leaving yourself open to unfavorable trades.
Yep, before damage.
Okay. Sure.
Okay, before damage, he's going to use the activated ability there
10, go to 1.
on the bodyguard.
I gain 4 up to
And he's
16.
taking
Yep.
10 here, Reed. He's down to just 1 life is Taejun. How in the world is he going to get out of this? Is the answer he's not?
Well, he needs to draw something that can really take a lot of power and toughness off the board. Maybe Conclave Tribunal would be a start.
He drew Benalish Marshal.
Okay, that's good. That can allow some favorable blocks. Remember, he does have 2 lifelink creatures, and that was just a temporary bonus from the History of Benalia. By the way, it seemed to me that Taejun Hao missed one sort of techie play that he could have made was just to block a 6 power creature with the Adanto Vanguard and give it indestructible. He saved 2 points of life that way. But instead, he did use his Dauntless Bodyguard to prevent a lot of damage and only lose 1 creature
Life totals are 1 to 16.
for his troubles.
Yep.
Looks like we have Elenbogen at 16 rather than 12. There we go. And Tay's going to go ahead and attack here.
Yeah,
He played the Benalish Marshal first, so it's 4 damage.
So remember, for as
Respect
bad
that
as as bad as these blocks look, the 2/2 lifelink tokens, and there should be one more on the way from Adanta the First for it. They allow a little bit of flexibility for Taejun Hao to protect his life total, and perhaps, leave one small attacker to get through
cards?
and recoup the life with his lifelinking creatures.
Exile the flyer. Target my flyer.
And that does it. You see that Andrew Elenbogen finds the removal spell to get rid of the only flying blocker on the other side of the table, and that leaves the way clear for his own flyer. And Andrew Elenbogen takes down game number 1 of this best-of-5 semifinals. We're going to bring you another pre-sideboarded game, and of course the rest of the match, and a whole lot more right after these messages. Welcome back to the feature match area here in Atlanta, Georgia. Marshall Sutcliffe, joined by Reed Duke, and well, we're in the first semifinal match. It's a best of 5. We're just settling in here. Andrew Elenbogen found the win thanks to Conclave Tribunal on that last turn, and he wins it. Now we're right back into the action here, though, because we won't hit the sideboarded games until after this game goes by.
We didn't mention, but flying actually a pretty important ability in these mirror matches where the ground tends to get clogged up. And we had talked about those lifelink tokens holding the fort for Taejun Hao, but Andrew Elenbogen finding a nice way to circumvent that problem by just attacking for the last point of lethal damage in the air.
All right, we're underway here in game number 2. Scrum Archer Aspirant's the first play of the game on Taejun Hao's side of the battlefield. Let's see if Andrew has a 1-drop to match it. He does. He's got Dauntless Bodyguard, so a pair of 2/1s facing off, no relevant abilities at the moment.
On the topic of flying being important, I'm curious to see whether Taejun Hao will offer the trade or instead try to wait until he can ascend to the City's Blessing and make his 2/1 little something special.
Yeah, he decided not to. He just passed the turn back, and Elenbogen says, sure, I'll send in. offering the trade for either of the two creatures on the other side of the battlefield.
So you'll often see a player who's on the play with a good hand not really worry so much about his life total. I think it would be totally within the realm of reason for Tae-Jun Hao to take this damage here. However, he's going to take a look at his hand. He's going to decide, do I have Legion's Landing that I need to transform? Do I need to worry about my number of permanents for the City's Blessing? There are a lot of reasons why he would either trade to protect his life total or decide not to trade and keep more bodies on the battlefield.
Guard Aspirant.
Yep.
Yeah, then 2 go.
So 1-drop into a pair of 1-drops now for Andrew Elenbogen after Tae-Jun Hao decided to go ahead and take that damage.
Yep.
And the perfect 3-drop, or at least one of them, History of Benalia. Now, this is one of the ways, this is one of the premier cards, as you mentioned, Reed, in this deck. And we're going to see why this game, because he's going to start generating a lot of board advantage off of that one card.
Both History of Benalia and Legion's Landing are really nice for achieving the City's Blessing because they're permanents in themselves, but they also generate creatures separately. So History of Benalia, for example, is going to give you 3 permanents for the price of 1 card, and we could see Tae-Jun Hao getting the City's Blessing as early as next turn, turn 4.
I'm going to play Legion's Landing. Sorry, I didn't answer the last game.
He's going to play a Legion's Landing.
That's nice because he has fair attacks here. Of course, Tae-Jun Hao could trade, but Andrew Elenbogen can attack, offering even
also
exchanges and transform
Transfer.
his Legion's Landing, which we've seen mana advantage in the early turns being quite important here. Looks like he has something even better.
Boom! Venerated Loxodon hits the battlefield, and he tapped 5 creatures to cast it, Reed. So, oh man, how about that? Maximum Venerated Loxodon value.
Yeah, tremendous amount of value. And I was just saying about mana advantage, Andrew Elenbogen didn't even play a land that turn, and yet he's able to cast 7 mana worth of cards. So taking a temporary turn off from attacking his opponent's life total in exchange for getting a commanding board presence.
Yeah, a nice jump forward there for Andrew Elenbogen, looking to move closer and closer to game number 3 with 2 wins in his pocket. And a reasonable start for Tae-Jun Hao, but Andrew has just flooded the board, and the other side just doesn't have the tools to deal with this many creatures.
Yep.
He has to go creature for creature.
Yep.
Or make his creatures bigger. There's Benalish Marshal.
Yeah, that's a nice one. If that will survive in the long run, then he's going toe-to-toe with Andrew. One thing you'll notice when the board state gets complicated and clogged up like this is that there is an advantage to the blocking player. Being able to line up things as you like, perhaps multi-blocking larger creatures. This is something that's really important, and those night tokens have vigilance.
Mm-hmm.
So while neither player perhaps is going to be winning the game in the next turn or two, this is going to be a tricky sequence of turns to navigate for Andrew to decide whether he can send in some of these larger creatures, how Tay might decide to multi-block or protect his own life total. And then, of course, he has History of Benalia Chapter 3 coming next turn, so we'll see if he can mount his own offense.
Another big decision point coming up for Elenbogen next turn is he does have a Conclave Tribunal in his hand. The most attractive permanent, perhaps Benalish Marshal, but he's going to have to work his way through the list of options and see what he can do.
Okay.
All right, a big play, but a dangerous one, also leaving himself vulnerable for this one turn to a big attack.
So this was a Venerated Loxodon for Tae-Jun Hao. He ended up getting 4 creatures tapped for it, so 4+1/+1 counters distributed on each one, and he has the Benalish Marshal pumping them as well. But the shields are down at this point. That said, Tae-Jun Hao, 18 life. You know, it's going to be tough for Elenbogen to just straight up kill him here.
I agree, but I've been surprised at how quickly 18 life can dwindle to 0 in the face of these white aggro decks. Surely Taejun Hao is crossing his fingers that Andrew Elenbogen won't have a third land and Banalish Marshal, because that would allow him to make all of his creatures 4 power and have a very profitable attack. Instead, he's going to decide, am I willing to lose a creature to that 4/4 Loxodon? How important is it for me to transform my Legion's Landing? So a lot to think about from Elenbogen's side this turn.
By the way, Reed, like, take a step back and look at this board state. That's off of 2 lands.
Yeah, the Convoke mechanic is unbelievable. And also, transforming Legion's Landing does a lot of work in this deck, giving you just that 1 extra mana is sometimes all you need.
He has 20 power on the battlefield, and he's used his 2 lands to do it.
Tribunal, exiled Banalish Marshal.
And there is that Tribunal. It does hit Banalish Marshal, so that's going to go away.
Go ahead.
Now, there hasn't actually been a meaningful attack since the second turn of the game for Elenbogen, but it feels like the storms are coming here if you're sitting in Taejun Hao's seat, just with how incredibly huge this board state has ballooned to for Elenbogen.
This is shaping up to be a fascinating game. It's one that's relatively even, where both players are going to have to worry about their own life total. Remember, we have history of Benalia going off here, so Junhao has Vigilance attackers available that can unload some massive damage. So while it's not necessarily a commanding position for him, if he can drop Elenbogen's life total to, say, 14 or 11, some lower number, then that is going to restrict the way that Elenbogen can attack the following turn. So both players having to manage offense and defense at the same time, which is somewhat rare in this matchup. Sometimes you see one player just running away with it. Not the case here.
Okay, well, he's just going to attack with the Knights.
So these are 5/4 Knights.
Right.
Those 5/4s, right?
Yeah.
You can hear the players confirming.
Elenbogen is just like making sure I'm not crazy here. These are 5/4s, right? And Tay says, yeah, they are.
Block both of them. 4 damage, sack, and make my guy indestructible.
And you heard Andrew explain what his thought process was there. He gets to basically eat up all of that damage, so take 0 for the turn while only losing 1 Dauntless Bodyguard in the transaction. And he figured I would trade a Dauntless Bodyguard for 10 damage here, so that's what he did.
Sorry, what are you tapping?
Ooh, another
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Venerated Loxodon now for Taejun Hao. So 2 counters now on those Knights. The Vigilance coming in handy there as he was able to attack with them and get the counters on after. And boy, these Anthem effects are really starting to add up on both players' sides, especially Tay.
Yeah, most definitely. One thing I noticed here, though, is that 3 mana being unused, and it makes me wonder if, like the first game, Taejun Hao has run out of gas, drawn a few too many lands, and if that's the case, we'll see, as we talked about last game, if he can push the early advantage or if he's going to stagnate and sort of be at the mercy of his opponent's draw.
I typed you were 2 on turn 2, so you're at 18, right?
Yeah.
Out of gas confirmed.
Oh, 18, 19. Sorry. My handwriting is really, really bad. I apologize.
How's your handwriting, Reed?
I can read it. That's about all that matters.
Passes the most basic test. Mine's pretty bad,
I
too.
will go to combat.
I know how Andrew feels. He's going to go to combat, and he's got 2 hands lined up here to start declaring these attackers.
So remember, a key card to think about here is Legion's Landing, and if he can make good use of that 3rd mana by transforming it.
3, 2,
Yeah.
4, 4, 2, 1.
Yep.
Andrew does have the city's blessing, as you can see, so these Sky Marchers are flying.
Taejun Hao certainly has the power and toughness advantage on this board, so I think he's relatively happy to make even trades here and preserve his life total and perhaps unlock some nice attacks for next turn. I would certainly expect him to make the blocks that he's lined up here which are even trades.
2 trades.
Sorry, not that one. I'll save the aspirant.
Yeah.
So he's going to sacrifice the Dauntless Bodyguard to make the aspirant
Damage.
indestructible. He's going to drop down to 16, keep both of his flyers, and trade off the 4/4 Venerated Loxodons. But key here is that he did get to transform into Adanto the First Fort, which allowed him to dump the rest of his hand on the battlefield and will turn a next land draw into a lifelink vampire-making machine.
So speaking of out of gas, that was the last card from Elenbogen's hand. But as you mentioned, Adanto means he'll be able to make a big play almost no matter what next turn.
Adrian Howe found a nice one off the top of the library there, Penalish Marshall. And once again, we've entered the combat math section of our of our turn. Although Tajun Howe says, I like the looks of this. I'm getting in. Wow, this is a huge attack from Tajun Howe.
Yeah, that's right. So the 5/5 Knights, 6/6 Venerated Loxodon, 4/5 Rustwing Falcon.
20?
Looks like 20 to me.
Man, this deck's damage output is just incredible.
So Elenbogen can use an expensive 4-life fog on the largest creature by blocking with a Adanto Vanguard and making it indestructible. He can, if he would like, double block to trade with a Knight token. Seems like he's lining that up. He's got to think about what's his plan for winning this game. What can he draw to stabilize this board or get back in it? Probably the best answer is Banalish Marshal, perhaps Conclave Tribunal. But for now, he's got to play defense, worry about his own life total, survive as long as he can to give himself outs at those draws.
Pay 4.
15.
Yep.
And so damage.
Yeah.
You're gonna take 4, 5, and you gain 2. So you
Wait. This is 3 and this is. Wait, no, sorry.
this is 4.
This is.
4 and this is 5, right?
So I take 9 and I
and you
gain
gain
2.
two.
So I take 7 net, right?
You got an 8,
Yeah.
and then
Get
this.
these trade.
Yeah.
So a lot of the board state going away and a lot of Andrew Elenbogen's life total following with it. He's now down to 8 after that sequence of blocks. Needs to find something to get himself back ahead here.
All right, surveying the board. I think this is a position where
What are you at right now?
we might see him attack with only his lifelink creatures, focusing again on his own life total rather than his opponent's. We're at that stage of the game. He does have a nice Air Force. That's one thing that Elenbogen has going for him. It's difficult for Tajun Howe to block his creatures,
Yeah,
whereas
in for 6.
it's easy for Elenbogen to block Tajun Howe's creatures, although not necessarily profitable based on their size.
So he's going to have to do the math to see if he can figure out a way to race here. He could attack for 6 in the air, knock him down to 10. If he could survive the next attack, would a Banalish Marshal be enough? And the answer is not quite.
Go ahead.
And he's just going to pass the turn back here.
Wow, so I wonder if he's drawn one of the very few cards that he can't cast on his main phase. It could be Pride of Conquerors, which would actually allow him to make some profitable blocks. Looks like it's Conclave Tribunal, though.
He must have determined that he couldn't even tap one of his creatures to cast it.
Oh, and Legion's Landing, a big pickup for Tajun Howe here, because that's a mana sink. Even if things go horribly wrong from this position, he can continue generating tokens and using his mana. So at least he's not going to stagnate like he did in game 1.
I'll take him in the final again.
Elenbogen moving to blocks, but he's under extreme pressure at this point. Tajun Howe has firmly moved into the lead in this game over the course of the last 2 turns, applying huge pressure, knocking Andrew down to 8, and now looking to deliver the final blow as he forces Andrew into some blocks that will leave his board decimated and his life total low.
In a way, this is the real game plan of the white aggro deck, which is to make its creatures huge and get the opponent into chump block mode as quickly as possible, because usually that's the signal of the end, is when the blocking player has to just make unfavorable blocks and lose creatures. It becomes,
4 damage.
like you're sliding downhill and you can never get your footing, and the white weenie deck never gives you an inch of breathing room.
Yeah.
I think we're at that position with Taejun Hao against Andrew Elenbogen, game 2 here of the semifinals.
So that resolves.
Yeah, that resolves.
I'm.
That was Pride of Conquerors in
I
his
will-
hands.
I will
It
pay
looks
for it.
in his hand. It looked like.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes more sense to me. I think almost any other card he would have deployed on his main phase,
That's what it felt like.
but he's able to make some reasonable blocks here. 3 points of lifelink from the Hawk. He did use 4 life to make a Danto Vanguard indestructible, so he's going to actually get the Lockstone off the battlefield, and things have, while not necessarily swung in Ellenbogen's favor, they've stabilized at least a tiny bit.
He needs
He's going
help
to
here,
get some
though.
draws.
He needs something huge here. Whew.
Go.
Benalish Marshall, is that good enough, though? It doesn't look like it.
Well, a 3/3 blocker can hold off the vampire tokens. It can threaten to trade against the opposing Marshal, but that 5/5 Knight token is still a big problem.
And it looks like Taejun Hao top deck there and just showed him the card, and that was going to be it.
Flip this time.
And that is game number 2 going to Taejun Hao. So we are all tied up now at 1 game apiece in our semifinal here, Reed. And as we know, we play best 3 out of 5 here on Sunday at the Pro Tour. If you're just joining us, thank you for coming along. We're really happy to have you join us for this semifinal match. We've got yet another semifinal coming your way right after this. That's going to be Jeremy Dezani versus Luis Scott Vargas. So 2 heavy hitters, 2 Pro Tour champions colliding in the other semi. And right now, they're sitting, waiting in the wings, and wondering if they win that, who they're going to end up playing against. It's going to be one of these 2 gentlemen right here, Taejun Hao from Singapore or Andrew Elenbogen from the United States. We've got sideboards here to look at. So let's take a look at our first sideboard. This is Taejun Hao's red-white aggro sideboard. Now, what could we see? What will we see, Reed?
Well, some of these cards are tailor-made for slower matchups. Experimental Frenzy, Banefire. These are cards that are not necessarily mana efficient, but they give you a big advantage or a form of reach if the game goes long, say, against a control deck. Not necessarily expecting those to come in. However, extra removal spells, Baffling End, perfect for taking out that Benalish Marshal, which is one of the cards that the matchup hinges on. Lyra Dawnbringer, of course, a creature that's able to dominate the board, stabilize you if you find yourself in a bad spot, and then Settle the Wreckage and Response Resurgence are interesting options as well. I would love to see Response Resurgence put to interesting techie use in this match. That would be fun.
Okay, on the other side, we've got Andrew Elenbogen. Sideboard looks a little different here, doesn't it?
Yeah, in spirit, it's the same. The Banefires, the Experimental Frenzies, the Ajanis, all cards that can come in to give him a little bit of extra firepower for slower matchups. Tecatli Honor Guard, not interested here in a mirror match, but we could see Ajani, we could see Response Resurgence, and we could see him going up 1 or 2 lands just to make sure that he comes out early, as the first 3, 4, 5 turns of the game are really what's going to determine who wins in most of these cases.
We see the 2 lands in this sideboard. I'm sure there's some people in our chat or some of our viewers going, what do they have lands in there for? What are those? What's the purpose of having a land in your sideboard? We saw one from Taejun Hao as well.
For one thing, Andrew Elenbogen has no red cards in his main deck. He is mono-white in his main deck, so he wants to keep a low land count, make sure all of his lands produce white mana, and they all come into play untapped. That's really important for the white aggro deck coming out nicely. However, you see some red cards in the sideboard, so he wants access to extra red mana to ensure that he can cast them. And sometimes he's just going to raise his mana curve. I mean, Ajani is a 4-mana card. That's not trivially easy for a deck with only 20 lands. So just smoothing out both his colors and his number of lands with those 2 clifftop retreats in the sideboard.
When you look at these sideboards, Reed, do you get the feeling that these players had the mirror match in mind, or that type of matchup in mind, or were they gearing their sideboard towards perhaps other decks that they anticipated in the field?
I would venture to guess that these players have a plan that they thought a lot about in advance of the tournament for the mirror match. However, the sideboard options against Control, the Banefires and Experimental Frenzies, those are really, really potent. The sideboard cards against Golgari, the Tocatli Honor Guards, the Ajanis, the Experimental Frenzies, those are really, really potent. It's not clear that you really want to change much in the mirror match, since this is so much about just coming out smoothly and getting a big board presence, and that's what the main deck does best anyway. So I think these players will only change a few cards, and we'll see their primary plan A game plan relatively intact, even for the sideboarded games.
Take a look at Taejun Hao. This is his first Pro Tour top 8. In fact, both of these players, it's their first time making it this far.
I remember that Taejun Hao had a deep run with humans in the modern Pro Tour last year. That was Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. So no stranger to going deep in the Pro Tour, no stranger to playing these complicated combat-based aggro decks. And I think that experience is paying off here.
And I will be on the play. Yeah,
I've been impressed by the play of both of these guys so far in this tournament, but you can tell a little bit from the difference in table demeanor between the two. Taejun Hao seemingly very calm and collected, and Andrew a little bit more emotive.
Yeah, this is Taejun Hao's 6th Pro Tour, and no stranger to the high-level Magic scene. 36 GPs played as well. For Andrew, this is his 4th Pro Tour, but he's played 65 GPs. So Andrew, very much not a stranger to the Grand Prix scene as well.
Marshall, I saw several sideboard cards in Taejun Hao's opener. Lyra Dawnbringer, which we expected to come in. That's an exciting one for this matchup. Potentially could give him a large advantage if he gets to his 5 mana, but he also brought in Make a Stand.
Really?
To give his creatures +1/+0 and indestructible. We did see Andrew Elenbogen use Pride of Conquerors to relatively good effect in Game 2, although he did wind up losing. But Make a Stand, that type of card that can allow you to win the crucial combat step, can be really good here. You just have to keep that effect to a healthy minimum to make sure that you do have enough creatures to use it to its full efficiency.
Yeah, there's definitely some combats in the last game that would have that Make a Stand would have been a blowout. We'll see if that pops up here. 1 drops for each player on turn 1. Elenbogen lining up his plays here on his 2nd turn. He's got Legion's Landing. Go.
Perhaps that is a difference between a pre-board game and a sideboard game. If we're bringing in stuff like Lyra, Make a Stand, to Johnny, that has to come at the expense of some of the creatures. So where we saw these players opening with 3 1-drops in the first pre-boarded game, that becomes a bit less likely if you're taking out stuff like, I don't know, Dauntless Bodyguard, Rustwing Falcon, some of your less exciting early plays. You're not going to come out quite as fast. Looks like a choice between multiple 2-drops here. Going to go with Baffling End.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Sometimes people put the creature underneath the Baffling End, but remember, if the Baffling End goes away, they end up with a 3/3 dinosaur token, not whatever was under it originally. So a relative stalemate here early. Read this one off to a slow start, not the explosive fireworks that we've seen out of some of the draws from this deck. And players kind of taking their time. Andrew's going to offer the trade.
One subtlety about these
declined.
games is keeping an eye on if and when the players offer trades. And the fact that Andrew Elenbogen on the play did not attack his 2/1 into the opposing 2/1, that may have tipped Taejun Hao off to the fact that he needs his creatures in play for something, for City's Blessing, for Convoke, very likely, for transforming Legion's Landing. And that could have informed Taejun Hao's sort of difficult decision to cast the Baffling End on turn 2. So paying attention to these subtleties is something that is going to give the sharp players an advantage, something that we can watch for in the booth and at home, something that makes this matchup very fascinating and challenging to play.
Oh, it's great stuff. Yeah, this is a very difficult matchup. The good news, especially if you're relatively new to watching Pro Tour Magic with us here, is that almost all of it happens on the battlefield, right? It's all visually represented. I mean, I'm a fan of a control mirror, but that can be pretty difficult to explain to a player who isn't as experienced. Here, this is where, you know, you can have your friends tune in to watch, and they can actually see everything that's going on here in our top 8, because for the rest of the way, we're going to be doing this, getting creatures sideways to figure out who wins.
I actually had the experience just a few minutes ago of I was watching the screen during my off round, and one of our security guys who doesn't really know Magic was asking me, well, what's going on? How do you know? And
Oh, really?
my answer was kind of, the player with a bunch of white creatures is usually winning.
You know?
the guy with more cardboard on the table is
Yeah,
in good
and
shape.
in that spirit, let's just do that. That is actually, it's funny because as complex as Magic is, a simple snapshot would give you a pretty good idea of who was winning, just who had more stuff. Wow. Jeez, look at this turn from Andrew Elenbogen. Man, I spoke a little too soon about that slower start, because he ended up really firing it off there with the History of Benalia, and now he follows that up with another turn. History goes to Chapter 2, Conclave Tribunal to take out the Benalish Marshal. And look at Taejun Hao. His board state, 2-1. That's it. That's what he has. On the other side of the battlefield, there's like 12 power or something.
Been really impressed by the particular interaction of Vigilance creatures plus Convoke. That's just that makes for the most amazing turns out of this white aggro deck, is when you can attack, put your opponent in a tough position, and then cast a Convoke spell post-combat. You really get to have your cake and eat it too, unload damage, put your opponent in a tough position, and get this huge mana advantage by convoking out your bigger spells, Conclave Tribunal and Venerated Loxodon. Taejun Hao going to need something relatively special to get back in this game, although we did see he's got that Lyra Dawnbringer, and once that card enters your deck post-sideboard, you start to feel like you're never really out of it. No matter how bad the situation looks, if you can play Lyra Dawnbringer and she survives, you could stabilize some pretty unfavorable board positions.
So I don't want to lose track of all the things that are happening now.
Yeah, I believe that actually the judge might have just paused Taejun Hao for a second. Perhaps he's just in the tank, but he's been thinking for quite a while. Yeah, the judges are actually just double-checking something from a turn ago, so...
I cast a knight, a vampire token, and an Benalish Marshal. And then I play for 1 land, so 4 total.
Okay, perfect. Then we are fine.
Yeah,
You can continue your game.
that's what I did.
Okay.
Start up.
Okay.
Just gonna give you this back first.
Looks like they were just double-checking the Conclave Tribunal.
You're in a tough spot, so
Was paid appropriately, and Andrew Elenbogen looks like he's auditioning for a spot in the booth here, Reed, because he said, you're in a tough spot, and he's not kidding. Your security guard snapshot of the board state reveals a very difficult position now for Taejun Hao. Like you said, he could get to the point of getting a Lyra Dawnbringer, something special, you said, and that she is exactly that, but boy, it might just be too late.
Yeah, that's still
of
at
turns
a
away
minimum
still.
of 1 turn away, so he needs to do something, and History of Benalia is coming off Chapter 3 next turn with, don't forget, Benalish Marshal being a knight as well, so that's going to add an additional 6 power and 3 toughness to this already challenging board state. it seems that maybe Taejun Hao actually benefited from that confusion, a few extra moments to think about a tough position.
Yep.
Okay, Dauntless Bodyguard.
Yep.
And a Venerated Loxodon is the follow-up. So that's where Taejun Hao ended up on this. But he did have to tap, well, had to. He chose to tap 2 of his creatures to do this, leaving himself with a lonely blocker. And let's not forget, History of Benalia, Chapter 3 incoming here as well, Reed. Can
So
he even survive this?
The best he can hope for is that Elenbogen is hesitant to send his 5/4 Benalish Marshal into combat against the 4/4 Venerated Loxodon. 2 things going on that turn. The most important of which is just that I think Taejun Hao decided he needed a 4/4 blocker. That was the key to the turn. But also setting up nicely if he does get to untap, now having an extra counter on those bodyguards is pretty nice. But Andrew Elenbogen with 5/4 creatures across the board, 5/4 Knights, 5/4 Benalish Marshal, 2/2 Vampire Token with lifelink, ability to transform his Legion's Landing. And this is it, Marshall. I mean, this is the turn where Taejun Hao needs to survive and hit a 5th untapped land for Lyra for us to have a game. And if he can't deploy Lyra next turn, or if he dies here, then it's all over but the crying.
Let's see what Elenbogen's working with. All right, there is a window of opportunity here for Taejun Hao. He will not be dying this turn.
And look at this. He does hold back.
He held back as well. So Taejun Hao, if he can find a land, could play Lyra Dawnbringer and make a big comeback here. Right now his hand is Make a Stand and Lyra. He's on 4 mana. He's deciding if he wants to eat the Vampire Token or trade for a Knight.
Yeah, now keep in mind that this is the one turn where History of Benalia went off. So these Knights are 5/4s now, but if the game continues beyond this turn, they're going to match up poorly against Venerated Loxodon, and of course they're going to match up poorly against Lyra. So Taejun Hao choosing to use his life total as a resource here in order to get a favorable board state for next turn.
No follow-up for Elenbogen with just lands in his hand, and this is a huge draw step for Taejun Hao. Can he hit a land to play Lyra and pull ahead in this game? Oh, he's going to sweat it. You know he is. Did he hit? No, he did not. Now, that does not mean it's over, though. He's down to 4 against 23 life here and 3 creatures, but he did take the time to grow out a pretty big board last turn thanks to that Venerated Loxodon, and he just found another copy of Dauntless Bodyguard.
This actually is a somewhat convenient draw for him, as he's able to deploy another creature while leaving up mana for Make a Stand, protecting his most important creature on the battlefield. In fact, double protecting it between Make a Stand and the Bodyguard is pretty nice. However, his position is relatively fragile. If Elenbogen can pick up Conclave Tribunal or any removal spell for the Loxodon, then he can crash in for a pretty decent attack.
So 4 creatures on the battlefield for Tay, 4 for Elenbogen. Oh, was that Conclave Tribunal off the top of the library? That would make his life a lot easier if it was.
Tribunal?
There it is. Conclave Tribunal hits the battlefield for Andrew Elenbogen. He's going to use that to take away the biggest blocker on the other side of the battlefield, the Venerated Loxodon.
But now you see the counters surviving on the Dauntless Bodyguards from the Venerated Loxodon, making a big difference here, allowing those creatures to trade favorably against the Knight tokens.
I will attack you with all 3 of my creatures.
So this is 3/3, 3/3, 2/2, right?
Yeah.
Andrew commits to an all-out attack. He also carefully tapped his mana so that he has the ability to make a Vampire Token. But here's Make a Stand.
Oh, yeah,
From
fantastic.
Taejun Howe, and look at this.
This is exactly why he brought it in off the sideboard to win an important combat step.
And Andrew's just losing his board here. He's going to be left with just Benalish Marshall, but a friend will be joining as well before Andrew's next turn. Is there a land on top of the library for Taejun Hao? Because he still has this ability now to play Lyra Dawnbringer and completely take over this game. Now, how far ahead is he here? Is he ahead, Reed? I mean, he's down to 4 life. He's got to be careful.
He is ahead. I think in the absence of Make a Stand, this would have been a bad position for him. Even Lyra Dawnbringer, perhaps, having trouble stabilizing against Adonto the First Fort plus Benalish Marshall. However, I am really impressed with the way Taejun Hao has navigated this game, even right from the position of sideboarding. It would not have been obvious to me that you want to bring in Make a Stand for this matchup, but here he's navigated his mana. He took the one sort of risky turn to deploy Venerated Loxodon, and every little detail about this game has been important. He's navigated perfectly, thread the needle, and now he's stabilized, going to get back his own Benalish Marshall, free from Conclave Tribunal.
Andrew Elenbogen will have seen that one coming. Tay drew his card and then picked up the Tribunal to see what was under it. It's a little bit of a telegraph there, but that's the play he was going to make regardless.
Do not open till Christmas.
Well, Christmas may have come early here for Taejun Hao. He is tied at 1 game apiece against Andrew Elenbogen and has methodically worked his way from being significantly behind to now it looks like quite ahead in this game, even though he still has a lot of work to do with Andrew sitting at a comfortable 25 life.
Another thing, Marshall, this is a situation where having deck lists is relatively important, because if I'm Taejun Hao, I'm facing this position in the Swiss rounds, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what if he draws heroic reinforcements? How do I protect myself from that with my life total so low? But Andrew Elenbogen, as we know and both players on the floor know, does not have access to heroic reinforcements anywhere in his 75.
One card in hand, Taejun Hao. He's like, yeah, it's probably not even that good. Lyra Dawnbringer waiting in the wings. And if Andrew can't find a way to start powering through this board state quickly, she will at some point show up. But look at this. Elenbogen's lining up an attack. Taejun Hao, he made that attack before, and he felt like it was fine. And look at this. Everything in the red zone for Elenbogen. Oftentimes when you think of these aggressive decks, especially ones that have access to red mana, you'll think of burn spells, but that doesn't play in here.
Well, it is hypothetically possible that Andrew Elenbogen could have Banefire, but not a card that I would necessarily expect to come in this matchup, since the creatures do get so large so fast. It's going to be a mana inefficient way.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it's a little difficult to see, but are these two bodyguards protecting one another? And if so, Junhao wants to make sure that he's lining up the creatures correctly to deal the maximum amount of damage to Elenbogen's attackers.
Right, because there's a good chance that bodyguard is protecting the bodyguard that's tapped.
I need you to make a decision.
Those are your blocks?
Yeah.
Okay. I will cast Pride of the Conquerors. I have the city's blessing.
Oh, Pride of Conquerors is what Elenbogen had in his hand that whole time. And he does have the city's blessing.
Your 2 guys die, this vampire dies.
So +2/+2.
Okay.
Wow, this looking like a bit of a disaster for Taejun Hao.
Seriously.
He put only a... Okay,
he ended up taking 3 there? Or
he put a 3-power
0.
creature in front of Benalish Marshall. So the Marshall survived via Pride of the Conquerors. He lost some creatures.
He did not draw a land here.
Yeah, he's struggled to find that 5th land for Lyra.
It was trusty Rusty, the Rustwing Falcon off the top of the library. Though I got to say, not really earning his nickname at this juncture. A little late to the party for Rustwing Falcon.
End step, make a vampire.
Quite outclassed by the board state that we see here. End step, Andrew Elenbogen makes a vampire. And he's building out a board, giving himself inevitability as Taejun Hao has not been able to find that extra mana. Uh-oh. Is this Venerated Loxodon? Oh, Venerated Loxodon off the top of the library for Andrew Elenbogen allows him to make a vampire and then put counters on all of them. Those are all lethal now. Every creature on the battlefield. Oh, not quite. They're one short of lethal, but any two hitting will finish off Taejun Hao. Did he find a land now?
That was the turn, Marshall. This was the turn that Taejun Hao really, really needed to cast Lyra, as his team is getting greatly outclassed between the Benalish Marshal and the Venerated Loxodon. He's going to be forced into some very unfavorable blocks. His life total, having gone low early in the game, now catching up with him, as he cannot afford to let creatures through unblocked.
Man, Adonto the First Fort absolutely taking over for Andrew Elenbogen this game. It has been his key card thus far. All Taejun Hao can come up with is History of Benalia, which is fine, but not going to put enough blockers in the way over the long term to fight Adonto the First Fort, pumping out 2/2s and in some case 3/3 life-linking vampires.
Taejun Hao going to be forced to block 4 creatures here, which means 4 relatively unfavorable blocks.
So this is chump block, trade, chump block.
Okay, pass birdie. Okay.
Can I go down to 1?
Yeah, you go to 1.
Yes, you're down to 1, Taejun Hao, and Andrew Elenbogen is on the precipice of winning game number 2.
This vampire dies, yeah.
This game really had some back and forths, and I thought for a while Taejun Hao was in the driver's seat, having both stabilized the board and waiting on that land for Lyra. He never found the land, and the key turning point in the game was when he lost his Benalish Marshal in combat. Normally, that creature is so important that you're going to see the players pointing their baffling ends and conclave tribunals at it. This case, Andrew Elenbogen's able to destroy it in combat, which was a huge swing and led to him winning this decisive game 3.
Andrew Elenbogen looks quite pleased with himself, and he should. That was game number 3 going his direction, putting him up 1 game and putting him just 1 game away from the from the finals. We're in semifinal number 1 here at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. We're in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Marshall Sutcliffe. I'm joined by Reed Duke, and we are bringing you coverage of the first semifinal. We will be bringing you coverage of the second semifinal after this one. That will feature Jeremy Desani from France playing against Luis Scott Vargas from the United States, and looking to see who's going to make it into the finals from that half of the bracket. The matchup is the same all around the tables. Red and white cards, primarily white, but there's some red cards here or there in the main decks or in the sideboards for all of our players.
These two that we're watching now defeated the outlier decks in our top 8. For Taejun Hao, it was Yuya Watanabe's Enigma Drake Blue-Red Izzet deck. For Andrew Elenbogen, it was
Wilson Mock's
Jeskai control deck, featuring 4 Deafening Clarions. Not quite enough.
Boy, that says a lot about this deck, doesn't it? If you have 4 Deafening Clarion in the main deck and you can't beat in a best of 5, like, what are you supposed to do?
It's a question I've been trying to answer for about a week, Marshall. I knew white was going to be big here. I tried my best to beat it, but it was not easy. I ended up with a 1-2 record against white aggro with my Golgari deck this weekend.
Looking forward for the brewers and tuners out there, do you think you can, if you anticipate a lot of the metagame to be this type of deck, do you think you can tune your green-black deck to beat it?
I think it's a fair matchup. I don't think there's anything you can do to be really, really excited to sit down against a white aggressive deck. I don't think the sky is falling. I mean, we have 6 in our top 8. That's a very dominant performance here at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. But I do think that there's a lot to this standard format, and it's not going to be all Benalish Marshals forever for the end of time.
Yeah. Well,
However, this deck is no joke. It's a multi-dimensional deck. It even the best cards against it, the board sweepers, you have Dauntless Bodyguard, you have a Danto Vanguard, you have expensive cards like a Johnny or Heroic Reinforcements to help you rebuild. You have a Danto the First Fort that you can transform. So this is a deck that you can't just play a couple of sideboard cards and say, I'm all set. This is a deck that you really have to work hard, go toe-to-toe, and keep pace right from turn 1 or 2 if you actually want to have a decent matchup.
You know, it's worth mentioning as well that this is a mixed format Pro Tour, right? Our Pro Tours are decided not just on constructed, but also on limited. And it can be a little misleading, right, to take a look at just which decks ended up making it to the top 8, because there's a good chance that a lot of the players that made it there off the back of a strong limited performance and not necessarily a dominant performance in constructed. Now, you know, when you get 6 of them, that is it gets a little hard to ignore at that point. But still, if you go further down the list after the top 8, it actually does stay pretty diverse for this field.
That's true. In fact, I can tell you that the most successful couple of standard decks this weekend were not white aggro decks. We had a blue-red Is It Drake deck go 10-0, which is an astounding performance at the Pro Tour level. And if you want to research a little bit, delve deeper into those non-top 8 deck lists, you can find them at wizards.com/magic.
Wow, look at you. You're a pro. Just jumps right in here and starts dropping URLs. I love it.
Yeah, I didn't even know I was going to be working today.
It's your day off? All right, players are just getting ready for the 4th game of our first semifinal.
So I do have a little bit of inside information about the way these players sideboarded. And I can tell you that it's much different between the two of them. Andrew Elenbogen was more the way I predicted. He didn't change much. His Adanto Vanguards, which are cards that are excellent against control, but not so good when you're being attacked and have to play offense and defense at the same time. He trimmed those to bring in some removal spells in Response Resurgence and 1 copy of a Johnny, just for a little more late-game power. Jun Hao, however, did some surgery. He changed a lot, bringing in Baffling End, the Make a Stand that we saw, his extra land, Lyra Dawnbringer, Experimental Frenzy. So his deck has changed substantially since the first 2 games. And though he was not the winner of Game 3, we did see his sideboard cards doing some work. The Make a Stand allowing him to win a really, really important combat step that I thought for a while was going to lead to him winning the game. The Lyra Dawnbringer, which threatened to stabilize the board, though he unfortunately could never find a 5th land. We'll see if these cards continue to come into play in the remaining 1 or 2 games of this match.
Okay. Boy, that Lyra Dawnbringer a few turns earlier could have turned that game around. Just too much time given to Andrew Elenbogen.
And really, it was too much time against Adanto the First Fort, and specifically the combination of Adanto with those Banalish Marshals and Venerated Loxodons. Each turn, Taejun Hao would draw 1 measly creature, play a Rustwing Falcon, play a Dauntless Bodyguard, and Andrew would make a 2/2 token and get access to whatever card he drew off the top. So that waiting game favoring so much the player who had been able to transform an early Legion's Landing.
Taejun Hao will be on the play here in game number 4. I think that Tay's in the tank here about whether to keep his opener.
Yeah, the early game mulligan, of course, a big moment in these top 8 matches, particularly in such a fast, explosive matchup like this one. Hand looks pretty good to me, but he decided to mulligan. I thought I saw 2 lands and 2 Baffling Ends, which can allow him to develop a little bit and protect himself, though vulnerable potentially to something like History of Benalia, which is a card you can't really answer at a 1-for-1 basis.
Elenbogen on the other side was like, keep. He was just waiting to hear what Taejun Hao had to say about his hand. You can see that Andrew Elenbogen, he's an intense personality down in the feature match area, and he has been playing really well this weekend. I heard him in between his quarterfinal match, kind of breaking down his play. He had identified a couple of lines of play that he regretted a little bit, thought he could have done better. But, that to me is the hallmark of a really good player, is somebody who can look back at their play and identify the good and the bad as well. He has a supportive group of friends here as well, cheering for him every time. I was in the feature match area down in the quarters, and when he won his, oh, you knew it.
The impression I get from Andrew is that he's a real student of the game. He enjoys the post-game debrief. He likes to be very clear and precise about what's going on in the game. He's working on his sideboard plans for his next match almost the second that he finishes the previous one. So a guy that's really just enjoying himself here at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica, which I do appreciate.
I would describe you that way.
I like Magic.
A student of the game. This is a 6-card opening here for Tae-Jun Hao, and it looks like he's deciding if this is one that he can take the battle. Remember, it's all on the line for him, and he has kept it. Excuse me, he was just resolving a scry there. But big pressure now because Andrew Elenbogen is up 2-1, and with a win in this game, he would be through to the finals. So it's all on Tae-Jun Hao's shoulders now to try to scrap his way back and force a 5th and deciding game. Let's see how this game pans out in the early stages, because oftentimes that can be it. Sometimes it settles into a rhythm like we saw in the last game where the game goes long and it becomes recurring sources of advantage. But sometimes this happens.
Oh boy, Marshall.
No plays yet for Tae-Jun Hao and 3 1-drops for Andrew Elenbogen out of the first 2 turns of the game.
I incorrectly forecasted that this start would be less likely after sideboard when the players go a little bit bigger, maybe take out some of their early creatures. But Andrew Elenbogen here punishing the mulligan from Tae-Jun Hao with a really fast start of 3 1-drops in the first 2 turns.
Yeah, I'll talk with everyone.
And everything's in the red zone. Andrew Elenbogen taking a moment to think it through and says, no, everything. Get him in there. Of course, one way to mitigate the power of a card like History of Benalia is just to simply take out the knights, making Chapter 3 a lot less relevant. It will cost you, though, as it spits out 2 knights over the course of the first 2 turns it's in play. And if you're trading card for card, you're losing card advantage by doing so.
Yeah, and that's huge here. The fact that Elenbogen did not have something super powerful to drop the hammer pre-combat like Benalish Marshall, it's really good news for Tae-Jun Hao as the History of Benalia, as we talked about, you invest the mana up front, you get a 2nd knight for free the next turn. So Jun Hao going to do a lot to stabilize the board here with his free knight and whatever 1 or 2 spells he can cast to help him stabilize.
Look at this start from Elenbogen. He plays his own History of Benalia, passes the turn back, but this is a powerful pair of 3-drops now for Tae-Jun Hao, and he even has a Rustwing Falcon to follow up as well. So this one's going to be very interesting. But the body language I'm getting from Elenbogen is that he feels like he's in a really good position. He's playing very quickly. And that's scary when you're on the other side and your opponent starts going, okay, do this. It often means that they see a line to victory. Now let's see if he can actually do so here. His hand has Pride of Conquerors in it and a Conclave Tribunal. And once again, Andrew Elenbogen has shown us the true power of this deck by making an incredibly wide board state off of just a few lands. He only plays 20 in his main. And you can see that he's leveraging some of the most powerful early drops in the format. Looks like he's come to a bit of a pause, and this happens quite often, though, because doing all this combat math is extraordinarily important here. But there we go, Conclave Tribunal to take out the Benalish Marshal, and we're going to see a big attack step here from Andrew Elenbogen. 4 creatures in the red zone, and he says, you figure it out. Again, History of Benalia on 2 for both players at this point, but Andrew, the one who was able to break serve from Tae-Jun Hao, even though he was the one who was on the play.
Tejun Hao not only has to think about this block, but he has to think about what is my plan for winning this game. Am I racing? Am I trying to stabilize? Am I trying to put large creatures onto the battlefield to block? One card that I'm thinking about here is Heroic Reinforcements. What if he has it in hand? What if he draws it off the top? Can he make a really big counterattack on the turn that History of Benalia hits Chapter 3? But that's a couple steps away, as he does have to survive this combat step first.
Yep.
Boy, Tejun Hao, when he kept this opening hand, must have thought, okay, just don't run me over super quickly, because his hand is absurd. Like right now, he has 2 more copies of Benalish Marshall, if that's even possible, and he already had played one and a History of Benalia.
Wow.
Next trade.
Looks like he's only got 2 cards left in hand, so perhaps not 2 more, but still, you know, any combination of 3 of those 3 drops is really tough to beat, as long as you don't get ran over. And it looks like that may be the case here, as Tejun Hao has fallen down to 6 life and is woefully behind on board. But yeah, he has a pair of Benalish Marshall in hand. There's one of them.
That's 6, right?
It's 5.
Oh, no, 5. Sorry.
There we go.
So 10-6, right? Okay.
Dauntless Bodyguard for Tejun Hao.
Yeah. You're thinking about what to bodyguard right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Remember, Andrew has Pride of Conquerors in his hand. Are we just done here, Reed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus the... He's got 5 creatures, plus the History of Benalia is going to go off next turn.
Looks like we're done. I mean, just at
think
face
we're just
value,
done
there's
because of the
3
flyers.
2-power flying creatures that can only be blocked by that 1 Rustwing Falcon. So any pump effect, even something as lowly as Benalish Marshall, would create a lethal attack. But Pride of Conquerors also is going to make the ground attack
And
huge threats.
here we go. Andrew Elenbogen taking probably the last draw step of our first semifinal match. And there's Pride of Conquerors, and that's going to do it. Andrew Elenbogen is into the finals of Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica in a convincing 3-1 victory over Tejun Hao.
Yes. But he can only block 1 flyer. There's 2 flyers.
That was a great match, Marshall.
Really
I
great.
particularly enjoyed game number 3, which had a lot of back and forth. So I was here trying to navigate the advantage bar. I couldn't keep it still. It kept going from one player to the other. I thought for sure Tejun Hao had stabilized and was going to win with Lyra, but she never came down.
Wow, exciting stuff down the stretch. And ultimately, a lot of fireworks on the battlefield there on that last game. It was interesting because you got to see 2 different looks from this red-white aggressive deck. You got to see the slightly slower, but still very powerful stuff from Tejun Hao, and you got to see the smallest, cheapest, widest threats on that last game from Andrew Elenbogen. And it turns out the faster one ruled the day there.
Yeah, and just getting the opponent in a position to make unfavorable blocks so quickly makes it really difficult to come back against this white deck. I mean, short of something like a board sweeper, a deafening clarion, a ritual of soot, which we don't have any of those left at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica. This is more about managing combat, and the player that gets ahead, force the opponent into chump blocks or unfavorable trades. That's the player that's really hard to catch up and stabilize against.
Yeah, and we did see that. Both players able to deploy the cards out of their hands, but once the creatures started making bad, unfavorable blocks, as you said, they hit the graveyard, and it just snowballs, and it was Andrew Elenbogen who ended up taking that one down. So we have our first finalist here in Atlanta. That means that we're going to start turning our eyeballs to semifinal number 2, which is going to feature Jeremy Desani and Luis Scott Vargas. This is 2 heavy hitters, 2 Pro Tour champions meeting in the semis for their chance to play for the trophy and the $50,000. We're going to be setting all of that up for you right after these messages.